The ultrasound screen showed nothing but silence where life should pulse. But when the vampire king pressed his cold palm against her rounded belly and whispered in an ancient tongue, three distinct heartbeats thundered through the machine. Now every supernatural court in the city wants to claim what grows inside her. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her lips together and adjusted the ultrasound wand against Elena Vasquez's rounded belly for the third time, watching the grainy black and white screen with growing concern. The gel felt cold against Elena's skin, and the young librarian's dark eyes searched Dr. Chen's face for any flicker of hope as the seconds stretched into an eternity of silence. 20 weeks pregnant and no heartbeat detected. Dr. Chen had delivered this news before, but it never became easier, especially when she looked at Elena's trembling hands clasped over her chest and remembered the joy in her voice during the first appointment when she'd shared that this pregnancy came after 3 years of trying and 2 devastating miscarriages. The cramped clinic felt smaller than usual, its beige walls pressing closer as Elena's breathing became shallow and rapid. Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic, but inside this sterile room, time seemed suspended in a bubble of crushing disappointment. Dr. Chen cleared her throat gently and set the wand aside, reaching for tissues that Elena would inevitably need. The fluorescent lights above them flickered once, twice, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance independently in the corners of the room. A chill swept through the space despite the warm September evening, and Dr. Chen glanced at the thermostat, wondering if the old building's HVAC system had finally given up completely. Elena's world crumbled in that moment of silence, her dreams of midnight feedings and tiny fingers wrapping around hers dissolving like sugar in rain. She'd planned the nursery in her small apartment, had already picked out names, had imagined telling the mysterious father about their child if she ever found him again. The man from that night, 6 months ago during the citywide blackout, remained an enigma, appearing and disappearing like smoke, leaving only the memory of intense gray eyes and words whispered in a language she couldn't identify. Elena's shoulders shook as the reality hit her like a physical blow, and she pressed her face into her hands, unable to look at the silent screen that should have shown the flutter of new life. Dr. Chen reached for her hand, offering what comfort she could, but before she could speak, the words that would begin the difficult conversation about next steps, the temperature in the room plummeted so dramatically that their breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. The shadows in the corners of the room began moving with purpose rather than randomness, flowing like liquid darkness toward the examination table where Elena lay. Dr. Chen stepped backward instinctively, her rational mind struggling to process what her eyes witnessed as the fluorescent lights flickered faster, casting the room into strobing illumination that made everything seem surreal and dreamlike. From the deepest shadow near the door emerged a figure that seemed to be carved from moonlight and midnight, tall and elegant with pale skin that appeared almost luminescent in the strange light. His hair fell in dark waves to his shoulders, framing a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all sharp angles and classical beauty that spoke of nobility and ancient bloodlines. But it was his eyes that made Elena's breath catch in her throat, those familiar storm-gray orbs that had haunted her dreams for months, now fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race despite her grief. Alexander Drakel moved with fluid grace that defied physics, each step deliberate and predatory, as he approached the examination table where Elena lay frozen between shock and recognition. The medical equipment around them began humming with electrical interference, monitors displaying erratic readings while the ultrasound machine's screen flickered between static and impossible images. Dr. Chen pressed herself against the wall, her scientific worldview cracking like glass as this impossible figure reached the table and extended one pale hand toward Elena's belly. His fingers were long and elegant, ending in nails that seemed slightly too sharp to be entirely human, and when they made contact with Elena's skin through the thin hospital gown, frost formed in delicate patterns around his touch. He spoke then in a language that sounded like wind through ancient trees, words that seemed to carry weight and power far beyond their syllables. His voice a low rumble that resonated through the small room and made the windows vibrate in their frames. The ultrasound machine responded as if his words were a command, the screen suddenly blazing with light and sound that filled the sterile space with the thunderous rhythm of three distinct heartbeats, each one strong and defiant and impossibly alive. Dr. Chen stumbled backward until she hit the wall, her clipboard clattering to the floor as she watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. The heartbeats on the monitor weren't just present, but powerful, each pulse sending waves across the screen that spoke of extraordinary vitality and strength that surpassed normal fetal development. Elena stared at Alexander with a mixture of wonder and dawning understanding, memories flooding back like a dam breaking in her mind. She remembered now the night of the blackout, how she'd been walking home from the library when the lights went out across the entire city, plunging familiar streets into darkness deeper than she'd ever experienced. She remembered stumbling in the absolute black and feeling strong hands catch her, remembered looking up into those same gray eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The conversation had been strange, filled with references she didn't understand about bloodlines and destiny and choices that would echo through generations. She'd thought he was speaking metaphorically when he warned her about consequences beyond mortal understanding, had assumed he was just another eccentric attracted to the apocalyptic atmosphere of the blackout. But now, watching him whisper to her unborn children in a language that predated modern civilization, she understood that every cryptic word had been literal truth. Alexander's eyes flashed crimson for a moment, reflecting the monitor's glow like a predator's in the darkness, and she saw the subtle shift in his features that revealed canines slightly too long and sharp for human anatomy. He didn't smile, but his expression softened as he looked at her, and when he spoke again, it was in accented English that carried traces of old European nobility mixed with something far more ancient and dangerous. "Elena Vasquez," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a prayer or an incantation. "You carry my heirs, the first vampire triplets born in over a millennium, children who will inherit the strength of both worlds and the weakness of neither." The words hit Elena like lightning, illuminating connections she'd refused to see, explaining the strange dreams that had plagued her throughout the pregnancy, the inexplicable cravings for raw meat, the way mirrors seemed to show her reflection differently when she wasn't looking directly at them. Dr. Chen found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper, asking questions that her medical training demanded, but that her trembling hands showed she wasn't prepared to hear answered. Alexander turned his attention to her then, and his gaze carried the weight of centuries, of power that could crush cities and wisdom that came from watching empires rise and fall like seasonal flowers. He explained with calm authority that Elena possessed rare O-negative blood, combined with dormant psychic sensitivity, that made her uniquely compatible with vampire genetics, that their meeting during the blackout had been orchestrated by forces older than human civilization. The pregnancy wasn't random chance but careful selection, the result of prophecies spoken when the world was younger and the barriers between species more fluid than modern humanity realized. Dr. Chen listened with growing horror and fascination as he described how vampire reproduction worked, how it required specific conditions and bloodline compatibility that occurred perhaps once in a human generation. These children would grow stronger than pure vampires, able to walk in daylight and feed on normal food while retaining supernatural speed, strength, and longevity. They would bridge two worlds that had been at war for millennia, potentially ushering in an age of cooperation or unleashing chaos that could destroy both species. Elena felt the babies respond to their father's presence, their heartbeats synchronizing with something deeper than mere circulation, a rhythm that spoke of shared consciousness and inherited power that made her skin tingle with electricity. Outside the clinic, sirens began wailing in the distance, not emergency vehicles but something else, something that made Alexander's expression darken with concern and urgency. He moved to the window and peered through the blinds, his supernatural senses detecting threats that human perception couldn't grasp. Every supernatural court in the city has already sensed the awakening, he told them, his voice carrying grim warning. The Fae will claim them as rightfully theirs, due to their mixed heritage. The werewolves will see them as an abomination that threatens natural order, and my own kind will view them as either the salvation of our dying race or dangerous experiments that should be destroyed before they can mature. Dr. Chen managed to ask what would happen to Elena, and Alexander's response chilled both women to their bones. She is bound to me now through supernatural law, he explained, her life force connected to theirs and mine through the ancient ritual of recognition that occurred when I acknowledged them as my bloodline. If the children die, she dies with them, but if she dies, they will survive as full vampires with all the hunger and darkness that entails. The choice before them wasn't whether to continue the pregnancy, but how to survive it. How to protect 3 children who would be the most valuable and dangerous beings in the supernatural world before they took their first breath. Elena placed her hands over her belly and felt the strong heartbeats that had been silent moments before, understanding finally that her quiet life as a librarian had ended forever, replaced by something magnificent and terrifying that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The journey through the city's financial district felt like traveling through a dream where reality shifted with each passing streetlight. Elena sat beside Alexander in what appeared to be an ordinary black sedan, but moved with supernatural silence through traffic that seemed to part before them without conscious awareness. She pressed her face to the window and watched familiar buildings slide past, office towers she'd walked by countless times during her lunch breaks from the library. But everything looked different now through eyes that had glimpsed behind the curtain of ordinary existence. When they stopped before what appeared to be a condemned building with boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls, Elena felt confusion ripple through her mind, until Alexander placed his hand over hers and suddenly the illusion peeled away like old paint. The decrepit facade dissolved to reveal a magnificent Gothic mansion that belonged in the pages of architectural history books, its dark stone towers reaching toward the night sky with elegant spires and intricate carvings that spoke of craftsmanship from centuries past. Ancient magic hung in the air like invisible fog, making her skin tingle with energy that the babies responded to with increased movement and stronger heartbeats. Elena understood without being told that this was how the mansion remained hidden in plain sight, cloaked by enchantments that made human minds simply refuse to acknowledge its existence, seeing only what they expected to see in this district of glass and steel. Alexander led her through iron gates that opened at his touch and up stone steps worn smooth by countless feet over generations, past gargoyles whose eyes seemed to track their movement, and under an archway carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Inside, Elena's breath caught in her throat as she took in surroundings that belonged in a palace rather than a city residence. The entrance hall soared 3 stories above them, its vaulted ceiling painted with frescoes depicting battles between winged figures and shadowy creatures, while marble columns supported balconies that curved gracefully around the space. Tapestries that looked medieval hung between portraits of stern-faced individuals whose eyes followed visitors with unsettling intensity, and Elena realized these weren't just decorations, but records of Alexander's 1,000-year reign, each face marking a different era of his immortal existence. Persian rugs covered floors of polished stone, their intricate patterns seeming to shift and move in her peripheral vision, while chandeliers that appeared to be carved from single crystals cast light that seemed both warm and cold simultaneously. The air itself felt thick with history and power, making Elena acutely aware that she stood in the heart of something ancient and significant that had existed in secret parallel to the human world she'd always known. Alexander guided her deeper into the mansion, where she met the inner circle that had served as his counsel and protection for decades or longer, each introduction revealing another layer of the complex supernatural society she'd inadvertently joined. Casimir appeared first, materializing from shadows with the same fluid grace as his king, but carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. His appearance suggested middle age with silver threading through dark hair and lines around intelligent eyes, but Elena sensed the depth of years behind his gaze that spoke of centuries rather than decades of experience. Alexander introduced him as strategic advisor and oldest friend, the vampire who had stood beside him through wars and political upheavals that shaped the modern supernatural world. Casimir studied Elena with frank curiosity, his assessment feeling clinical rather than judgmental as he examined the woman carrying what might be the future of their species. When he spoke, his voice carried traces of an accent she couldn't place, something European but older than any modern nation, and his words were carefully chosen with the precision of someone who understood the weight language could carry. "The pregnancy intrigues me," he admitted, "because vampire reproduction has become so rare that most of our kind have forgotten it's even possible, but your bloodline compatibility suggests this was orchestrated by forces that planned centuries ahead." Lydia joined them in what Alexander called the drawing room, her appearance immediately reassuring Elena because she moved with the confident competence of medical professionals everywhere. Unlike the others, she had clearly been turned relatively recently, her mannerisms still carrying echoes of human behavior patterns, and her clothing reflecting modern medical practicality rather than ancient elegance. Alexander explained that Lydia had been a physician before her transformation 50 years ago, specifically chosen and turned to serve as their supernatural medical expert when the need arose. She would monitor Elena's pregnancy with both modern medical knowledge and understanding of vampire physiology, ensuring the safety of both mother and children through what promised to be a dangerous and unprecedented gestation period. Lydia's examination was gentle but thorough, her questions probing in ways that revealed genuine concern rather than mere curiosity about Elena's condition and the supernatural changes already beginning to manifest in her body. Marcus proved to be an entirely different presence when he entered the room, his energy radiating controlled violence that made Elena instinctively step closer to Alexander, despite knowing she was safe. Where Casimir projected intelligence and Lydia competence, Marcus embodied lethal efficiency, his movements carrying the precision of someone who had turned killing into an art form over centuries of practice. His loyalty to Alexander was absolute and unquestioning, but Elena sensed that this loyalty was earned rather than commanded, based on respect and shared history rather than fear or obligation. When Alexander explained Marcus's role as enforcer, Elena began to understand the brutal realities underlying the elegant facade of vampire society. Marcus would be responsible for her physical protection, but more than that, he would eliminate threats before they could fully manifest, using methods that Elena preferred not to contemplate too closely. His presence reminded her that she had entered a world where violence was not an aberration, but a fundamental aspect of survival, where conflicts were resolved with permanent solutions rather than diplomatic compromise. As the evening progressed, Elena learned that vampire pregnancies were extraordinarily rare because the transformation process typically rendered female vampires sterile. And even when conception occurred, the supernatural nature of vampire physiology usually proved incompatible with fetal development. Most vampire pregnancies ended in the mother's death, as the developing child drained her life force faster than she could regenerate it, creating a tragic cycle that had nearly eliminated natural vampire reproduction entirely. These triplets represented not just potential heirs to Alexander's throne, but possibly the first successful vampire births in over a century, making them invaluable to a species facing slow extinction through attrition and violence. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket as she realized that her successful delivery might determine whether vampire civilization continued to exist or gradually faded into legend and memory. The supernatural networks that connected the hidden world worked faster than any human communication system, carrying news of the pregnancy across species boundaries and territorial divisions with speed that bordered on instantaneous. Elena learned that these networks operated through combinations of telepathic communication, magical resonance, and ancient alliances that had survived millennia of political changes and territorial disputes. Within hours of the triplets' heartbeats awakening, every major supernatural power in the city knew about their existence and was formulating responses based on their own political needs and territorial ambitions. Queen Titania of the Seelie Fae court responded first, her message arriving through Casimir in the form of flower petals that spelled out formal demands when scattered across his desk. The Fae claimed the children as rightfully theirs because mixed heritage traditionally fell under Fae jurisdiction according to treaties signed during the supernatural accords of the 14th century. Titania's position was that vampire-human hybrids represented a new form of Fae, neither fully mortal nor immortal, and therefore belonged in the Fae realm where they could learn to control their abilities without threatening either parent species. Elena felt a chill when Alexander explained that Fae custody meant the children would grow up in a realm where time moved differently, potentially reaching adulthood in months rather than years, shaped by Fae values and loyalty rather than vampire traditions or human ethics. The Werewolf Confederation's response came through more direct channels when Alpha Prime Jacob Morrison sent a formal declaration that the triplets represented an abomination threatening natural order that should be eliminated before birth to prevent catastrophic supernatural warfare. Morrison's position was that vampire-human hybrids would possess the worst traits of both species, while belonging fully to neither, creating unstable individuals who could trigger conflicts that would expose all supernatural beings to human discovery and persecution. His message implied that if Alexander refused to terminate the pregnancy voluntarily, the werewolf packs would take action to protect supernatural secrecy through whatever means necessary. Most chilling was the response from human authorities, who shouldn't have known about supernatural society at all. But the Human Inquisition had apparently been monitoring supernatural activities far longer than anyone realized. Their communication came through electronic channels that bypassed normal security, displaying knowledge about vampire politics and reproduction that suggested decades of careful surveillance and information gathering. The greatest threat came from within Alexander's own court, where Victor had been building support among vampires who viewed their king's attachment to a human as dangerous weakness that compromised their species' survival. Elena learned that Victor had served as Alexander's lieutenant for over 2 centuries, originally elevated to that position for his strategic brilliance and absolute loyalty. But power and proximity to the throne had gradually corrupted his perspective until he began viewing himself as more qualified to rule than his king. Victor's faction argued that Alexander's decision to father children with a human proved he had lost the ruthless edge necessary to protect vampire interests in an increasingly hostile world. They whispered in corners that hybrid children would inherit human weaknesses like mortality and emotional instability, while possessing vampire strengths, creating unpredictable individuals who might betray their own kind for human approval or acceptance. Victor's planned coup relied on convincing enough court members that the pregnancy represented an existential threat to vampire civilization that required immediate action, regardless of personal loyalty to Alexander. Elena began experiencing supernatural symptoms that started subtly, but grew stronger each day as the children developed and her own physiology adapted to accommodate their hybrid nature. Her senses sharpened dramatically, allowing her to hear conversations through walls and detect scents with canine precision that sometimes overwhelmed her with information. Sleep brought prophetic dreams that showed possible futures with startling clarity. Visions of her children grown to adulthood, wielding powers that could reshape the world or destroy it entirely depending on choices not yet made. Most disturbing was her growing connection to the triplets' developing consciousness, moments when she could sense their emotions and primitive thoughts, feeling their responses to external stimuli and their awareness of the supernatural energies surrounding them. Dr. Chen had been brought to the mansion for her own protection after Alexander realized that her knowledge of the pregnancy made her a target for every faction seeking control of the children. She struggled to reconcile her scientific training with the supernatural reality unfolding around her, trying to understand vampire physiology while accepting that some aspects of the pregnancy defied medical explanation entirely. Victor chose the annual court gathering to make his move, a formal event that brought together vampire nobility from across the Eastern territories to discuss political issues and territorial disputes that affected their collective survival. The timing was calculated to maximize his support while catching Alexander at a moment when he couldn't simply eliminate the threat without appearing tyrannical to potential allies. Elena had been hidden in the mansion's ancient crypts for safety, stone chambers that had served as refuge and fortress for centuries, their walls carved with protective symbols that glowed faintly in response to supernatural threats. From her hiding place, she felt rather than heard the violence erupting above, as Victor's coordinated attack began with challenges to Alexander's fitness to rule, followed immediately by armed assault from supporters positioned throughout the gathering. The triplets responded to their father's rage with increased activity and synchronized heartbeats that grew stronger and more distinct as the battle intensified above them. Elena experienced their distress as physical pain, her connection to their developing consciousness, allowing her to feel their fear and confusion as supernatural violence shook the mansion's foundations. Dr. Chen crouched beside her in the crypts, medical training warring with terror as she monitored Elena's vital signs while trying to understand how the baby's supernatural nature affected normal pregnancy physiology. Through their connection, Elena felt Alexander unleash power that had been carefully controlled for centuries, his fury at the threat to his family burning away restraint and revealing the vampire king who had conquered territories and eliminated enemies with ruthless efficiency. The sounds from above spoke of destruction on a scale that transformed the elegant mansion into a battlefield, furniture splintering and walls cracking under forces that human construction hadn't been designed to withstand. Victor's forces had underestimated their king's response to threats against his unborn children, discovering too late that protective instincts combined with centuries of accumulated power created something truly terrifying when properly motivated. Elena witnessed through her supernatural connection the moment when Alexander's mercy died, replaced by cold calculation that viewed Victor's rebellion not as political disagreement, but as attempted murder of his family that demanded permanent resolution. The betrayal cut deeper than physical wounds because Victor had been trusted friend and advisor, whose opposition proved that even Alexander's own kind viewed the pregnancy as weakness rather than strength, liability rather than hope for their species' future. When silence finally returned to the mansion, above, Elena understood that her quiet life had ended forever, replaced by existence in a world where love was vulnerability and family meant being willing to kill or die without hesitation or regret. The days following Victor's failed coup found Elena recovering in Alexander's private chambers, a suite of rooms that occupied the mansion's highest tower and offered panoramic views of the city sprawling below like a glittering constellation against the darkness. Her body ached from the stress of experiencing supernatural violence through her connection to the triplets, but more profound was the emotional exhaustion that came from understanding how precarious their safety truly was in a world where even allies could become enemies without warning. Alexander rarely left her side during those first vulnerable days, his protective instincts heightened to levels that bordered on obsessive as he monitored every change in her condition and responded to threats that existed more in possibility than reality. Elena found herself studying his face during quiet moments, noting the way centuries of careful control had carved lines of restraint around his eyes and mouth, the burden of leadership evident in shoulders that carried the weight of decisions that affected entire populations of supernatural beings. When she asked about his past, about the experiences that had shaped him into the cautious king who trusted so few and loved even fewer, Alexander initially deflected with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to maintaining emotional distance even from those closest to him. But as Elena's supernatural abilities continued developing, her growing empathic connection to him made deception increasingly impossible, and she could sense the deep wells of pain and loneliness that he had spent centuries learning to navigate alone. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm that shook the mansion's ancient stones and sent rain lashing against the tower windows with supernatural fury, as if the weather itself responded to the emotional turmoil within. Elena had been experiencing prophetic dreams that left her gasping and disoriented, visions of possible futures where their children grew up in worlds torn apart by supernatural warfare, and Alexander found her weeping with the helpless terror of a mother who could see danger approaching but felt powerless to prevent it. In that moment of shared vulnerability, his carefully maintained barriers cracked, and he began speaking of his own family, of parents and siblings who had ruled before him with wisdom and compassion until vampire hunters discovered their stronghold and slaughtered everyone he had ever loved in a single night of coordinated brutality. Elena listened as he described awakening to find his world destroyed, his family's bodies burned beyond recognition, their ancient bloodline nearly extinguished except for him alone, the youngest son who had survived only because he had been away from the stronghold when the attacks came. The weight of sudden kingship had fallen on shoulders barely prepared for leadership, forcing him to mature in months rather than decades as he struggled to hold together the remnants of his people while hunting down those responsible for the massacre. Centuries of ruling alone had taught him that love was vulnerability, that caring deeply for others created weaknesses that enemies could exploit, that the safest path was emotional isolation, even when it meant enduring endless loneliness. Elena understood then why her pregnancy terrified him on levels beyond political complications, why he struggled to fully embrace the joy of impending fatherhood when experience had taught him that everything precious could be ripped away without warning or mercy. Elena shared her own history of feeling different and displaced, growing up in foster care systems that shuffled her between families who never quite understood the quiet child who sometimes knew things she shouldn't know and dreamed about events before they happened. She had learned early to hide her intuitive abilities, to pretend that her accurate predictions about foster siblings' behavior and her uncanny ability to sense when adults were lying were just lucky guesses rather than supernatural gifts. The psychic sensitivity that made her compatible with vampire genetics had manifested throughout her childhood as vivid dreams that later proved prophetic, as moments of inexplicable knowing that made her feel isolated from peers who lived in simpler realities, where the future remained hidden until it became present. She had spent years in therapy trying to convince counselors and herself that her experiences were normal variations of intuition rather than genuine supernatural abilities, learning to suppress visions that proved accurate and ignore premonitions that could have prevented suffering if she had trusted them enough to act. The loneliness of growing up different had driven her toward books and libraries, seeking refuge in stories that acknowledged magic and mystery as natural parts of existence rather than symptoms of mental instability requiring medication or intervention. Elena revealed how she had always felt like an actor playing a role in her own life, pretending to be normal while knowing that something fundamental set her apart from the humans around her, a difference that had made romantic relationships feel hollow and temporary, because no one could truly know her while she hid essential aspects of her nature. Meeting Alexander during the blackout had felt like recognition rather than introduction, as if some deep part of her had been waiting for someone who could see her true self without fear or rejection. Someone whose own supernatural nature made her abilities feel like gifts rather than curses. Their connection had transcended physical attraction from the first moment, built on mutual understanding of what it meant to live apart from normal human experience, to carry responsibilities and abilities that others couldn't comprehend or accept. As they shared these intimate revelations, Elena felt their bond deepening beyond anything she had experienced in previous relationships, creating emotional intimacy that seemed to resonate through supernatural channels and manifest in physical changes that affected both her body and the developing triplets. The babies responded to their parents' growing connection with increased activity and stronger heartbeats that synchronized when Elena and Alexander were emotionally open with each other, their developing consciousness somehow aware that their survival depended on the strength of the relationship that had created them. Queen Titania's arrival transformed the mansion's gothic atmosphere in ways that seemed to defy physical laws. As springtime magic flowed through ancient stones and filled shadowy corridors with the scents of blooming flowers and fresh rain. Elena first became aware of the Fey Queen's presence when she woke to find frost patterns melting from the tower windows, despite the warm autumn weather outside, replaced by delicate vines that grew across the glass in real time, their leaves unfurling with supernatural speed, while tiny flowers bloomed and released perfume that made her dizzy with its intensity. The mansion's gargoyles stirred to life as Titania approached, their stone eyes tracking movement and their carved mouths opening to release sounds like distant wind chimes, while the very air seemed to shimmer with energy that made Elena's skin tingle and the triplets respond with excited movement that bordered on agitation. Alexander appeared at Elena's side with vampire swiftness, his expression tense with the wariness of someone preparing for diplomatic warfare rather than friendly negotiation, and Elena understood that Titania's visit represented opportunity and threat in equal measure. The Fey Queen materialized in the mansion's great hall, with casual disregard for locked doors and magical barriers, her beauty so overwhelming that looking directly at her felt like staring into sunlight, all golden hair and perfect features that seemed to shift subtly, depending on the viewer's perspective. She moved with fluid grace that made even vampire elegance appear clumsy by comparison, her presence filling the vast space with authority that challenged Alexander's dominion in his own stronghold. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through supernatural frequencies, making the mansion's crystal chandeliers ring like bells, while flower petals materialized from empty air to carpet the floor in patterns that told stories older than human civilization. Titania's offer was delivered with the formal courtesy that characterized high fae diplomacy, but Elena sensed layers of meaning and obligation beneath words that seemed simple on the surface. The Fey realm could provide absolute protection for Elena and the children, sanctuary in a dimension where time moved at different rates, and hostile supernatural courts could never reach them, regardless of their earthly power or influence. In exchange, the triplets would be raised as Fey nobility, learning the magic and wisdom of both courts while growing up in safety that no earthly stronghold could provide. Elena would retain her role as their mother, but their education and cultural formation would follow Fey traditions that emphasize different values and priorities than vampire or human society. Titania enhanced her proposal by sharing visions that showed possible futures where the children grew to adulthood in peaceful Fey gardens, their powers developing under expert guidance while they remained safe from the political conflicts that threatened to consume the earthly supernatural world. Elena felt herself drawn to the offer despite her growing attachment to Alexander and her desire to remain with him, because the maternal instincts awakened by pregnancy made safety for her children the paramount consideration that outweighed personal desires or romantic attachment. Titania's visions showed the triplets as young adults with perfectly controlled abilities, wise beyond their years and capable of bringing peace between supernatural factions through their unique perspective and inherited authority. But Elena noticed that in every vision Alexander was absent, his role in their lives reduced to genetic contribution rather than ongoing paternal relationship. The Fey Queen's magic made the peaceful futures feel tangibly real, allowing Elena to experience moments of maternal joy as she imagined watching her children grow up without fear, without the constant threat of violence that seemed inseparable from vampire politics and territorial disputes. But even as part of her yearned for the security Titania offered, Elena recognized the fundamental trap hidden within apparent generosity, understanding that accepting Fae protection would mean surrendering not just her relationship with Alexander, but her own agency in determining her children's futures. Alexander remained silent during Titania's presentation, his expression carefully neutral, despite the emotional turmoil Elena could sense through their growing connection, and she realized he was forcing himself to consider an option that would save his children even if it meant losing them forever. The triplets' heartbeats became increasingly agitated as their parents' emotional conflict intensified, their developing supernatural awareness, somehow detecting the possibility of separation that threatened the family bonds they depended on for survival and growth. Elena found herself torn between rational acceptance of Titania's superior ability to protect her children and instinctive rejection of any solution that would separate her from Alexander, whose presence had become essential to her emotional stability and sense of completeness. The decision hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, complicated by the knowledge that whatever choice she made would determine not just her own future, but the destiny of children who might grow up to reshape the supernatural world or destroy it entirely depending on the values and loyalties they learned during their formative years. Titania waited with Fae patience that could outlast human lifespans, her offer remaining open while Elena struggled with the impossible choice between love and safety, between keeping her family together and ensuring her children's survival in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart before they could even be born. Director Catherine Walsh had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, ever since rogue vampires had slaughtered her family and left her as the sole survivor with knowledge of supernatural society's existence and a burning desire for vengeance that had shaped every decision of her adult life. The Human Inquisition's coordinated strike represented the culmination of decades of research and development, combining cutting-edge technology with supernatural countermeasures designed specifically to neutralize the abilities that had made vampire courts untouchable for centuries. Elena's first warning came as electromagnetic pulses disrupted the mansion's magical defenses, ancient protective spells unraveling under technological assault that their creators had never anticipated when they wove power into stone foundations centuries ago. The attack began at dawn when vampire strength was naturally weakest, with specialized units equipped with blessed silver ammunition and electromagnetic weapons that interfered with supernatural abilities on frequencies that caused physical pain to any being whose existence depended on magical energy. Elena felt the assault as a physical blow transmitted through her connection to the triplets, their distress spiking as the mansion's protective barriers collapsed under sustained technological bombardment that made the ancient stones themselves scream with harmonic frequencies designed to disrupt supernatural consciousness. Alexander's response was immediate, but hampered by the electromagnetic interference that clouded his enhanced senses and slowed his supernatural reflexes to merely human levels, forcing him to rely on centuries of combat experience rather than overwhelming power as he fought to protect Elena and reach her location before human forces could complete their primary objective. Dr. Chen had been monitoring Elena's condition when the attack began, her medical equipment registering dangerous spikes in both maternal and fetal vital signs, as the babies responded to their mother's terror with movement patterns that threatened premature labor or worse complications that could kill both her and the children she carried. The coordinated assault moved with military precision through the mansion's corridors, neutralizing vampire defenders with weapons specifically designed to exploit supernatural weaknesses, while avoiding areas where their own electromagnetic countermeasures might interfere with mission objectives. Elena found herself separated from Alexander during the chaos, human soldiers equipped with portable EMP generators, creating dead zones where vampire abilities simply failed to function, allowing ordinary humans to overwhelm supernatural opponents through superior numbers and tactical preparation, rather than individual strength or speed. The capture operation succeeded despite Alexander's desperate defense, because Director Walsh had studied vampire psychology extensively and understood that threatening Elena would force the Vampire King to choose between protecting her and maintaining his strategic position, effectively paralyzing his decision-making process long enough for her forces to complete their primary mission. Elena awoke in a sterile government facility designed specifically for containing and studying supernatural subjects, her cell constructed with materials that interfered with psychic abilities, while monitoring equipment tracked every aspect of her physiological condition with invasive precision that treated her more as a laboratory specimen than a human being. The separation from Alexander created immediate complications as the triplets' heartbeats became erratic and weak without their supernatural connection to their father, their hybrid nature requiring constant contact with vampire energy sources to sustain proper development during the crucial stages of fetal growth. Dr. Chen found herself facing an impossible ethical dilemma when Director Walsh offered her a position as chief medical researcher for the project, promising unlimited resources and official protection in exchange for her expertise in monitoring the supernatural pregnancy and ensuring the children's survival until they could be studied and potentially weaponized for government use. Elena's condition deteriorated rapidly as the babies began failing without their father's presence, their heartbeats growing weaker with each passing hour, while invasive medical procedures attempted to understand and replicate the supernatural processes that sustained their development, treating them as biological curiosities rather than her beloved children whose lives hung in the balance. The facility's research protocols called for maintaining Elena's pregnancy until the children could be born and separated from their mother for individual study, but the hybrid nature of their existence made this increasingly unlikely, as their supernatural requirements conflicted with the purely technological environment that imprisoned them. Alexander rallied his remaining forces for a rescue mission that represented his last chance to save both Elena and their children. But the facility's defenses had been designed specifically to repel supernatural assault, creating a scenario where love and desperation might not be sufficient to overcome careful preparation and technological superiority. Time became the critical factor as Elena's body began rejecting the pregnancy in response to stress and separation, threatening to end the lives of the children who represented both hope for supernatural evolution and the deepest love she had ever experienced. While somewhere in the depths of a government bunker, Director Walsh prepared to extract whatever value she could from the failure of what had been intended as a long-term research project. Alexander's infiltration of the government facility moved with the lethal precision of a predator who had spent centuries perfecting the art of silent death. His weakened state from the electromagnetic assault during Elena's capture only sharpening his focus to razor-sharp intensity that left no room for error or hesitation. The building itself represented humanity's attempt to contain and study supernatural forces through technology and clinical detachment. Its sterile corridors lined with monitoring equipment that tracked movement and vital signs, while automated systems prepared to deploy countermeasures against any supernatural intrusion. But Director Walsh had underestimated the desperation of a vampire king whose mate and children faced imminent death, failing to account for how love could transform careful strategy into reckless efficiency that prioritized speed over safety and accepted any risk that brought him closer to Elena's location. The facility's defenses crumbled before Alexander's assault, like paper barriers, electromagnetic pulses, and blessed silver ammunition, proving insufficient against someone who had already absorbed their worst effects and survived. His supernatural abilities functioning at reduced capacity, but still overwhelming human responses that had been calibrated for normal vampire capabilities rather than the enhanced power that came from protecting family. He moved through security checkpoints like flowing shadow, leaving behind unconscious guards and disabled surveillance systems while following the psychic connection that pulled him inexorably toward Elena's location somewhere in the building's depths. The rescue became a race against time when he found Elena in premature labor, her body rejecting the pregnancy under stress that had pushed her beyond the limits of human endurance, while the triplets fought for survival at 24 weeks gestation, far too early for normal human babies to survive even with advanced medical intervention. Elena's condition had deteriorated catastrophically during her imprisonment, the separation from Alexander creating supernatural withdrawal symptoms that manifested as seizures and cardiac irregularities, while the baby's heartbeats grew progressively weaker as their hybrid nature failed to adapt to purely technological medical support. The government's research protocols had treated her pregnancy as a biological curiosity rather than a life-threatening emergency, their invasive procedures and constant monitoring adding stress that accelerated the labor process while providing no supernatural support for children whose survival depended on vampire energy that the facility's electromagnetic interference actively suppressed. Dr. Chen found herself thrust into the role of emergency obstetrician under impossible circumstances, her medical training warring with the supernatural reality that normal delivery procedures could kill both mother and babies, whose physiology defied everything she had learned about human reproduction. Alexander's arrival brought immediate relief to Elena's condition as their supernatural connection re-established itself. But the premature labor had progressed too far to stop naturally, forcing them to attempt delivery under conditions that offered little chance of survival for 24-week-old infants, even without the complications introduced by their hybrid vampire-human nature. The ancient ritual that Alexander performed represented his last desperate option, a sharing of immortal essence that had not been attempted in over a millennium because it carried risks that could destroy both participants if their supernatural compatibility proved insufficient to handle the transfer. Elena felt his life force flowing into her like liquid starlight, transforming her cellular structure at the most fundamental level, while creating bonds between them that transcended normal vampire-human relationships and approached the mystical unity that some legends claimed existed between true supernatural mates. The ritual granted Elena temporary vampire abilities that manifested as enhanced strength, speed, and healing capacity, but more importantly, it created a direct channel through which the babies could access their father's immortal energy, even while developing in her still human womb. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as Elena's vital signs stabilized and strengthened, while the triplets' heartbeats grew powerful and synchronized, their premature bodies somehow drawing strength from the supernatural energy that now flowed freely between all family members. Lydia arrived during the delivery itself, having followed Alexander to the facility with medical supplies and supernatural expertise that proved essential as they worked together to ensure the baby's survival during a birth that combined emergency medicine with vampire midwifery techniques that had been developed centuries ago for the rare occasions when their kind reproduced naturally. The combination of Dr. Chen's modern medical knowledge and Lydia's understanding of vampire physiology created an unprecedented collaboration that saved lives through improvised procedures that had never been attempted or documented in either human or supernatural medical literature. The triplets' birth occurred as explosions rocked the facility around them, government forces attempting to retake their installation, while Alexander's supernatural allies fought to maintain the perimeter that protected. The emergency delivery taking place in what had been designed as a sterile research laboratory. Elena felt each contraction as both human labor pain and supernatural energy transfer, her body adapting to the vampire abilities flowing through her system while simultaneously working to deliver children whose hybrid nature made them larger and stronger than normal human infants. The babies emerged with obvious supernatural characteristics that marked them as different from purely human children, their eyes already showing flecks of the silver that indicated vampire heritage, while their grips possessed strength that could leave bruises on adult hands. But despite their supernatural traits, they remained dangerously premature, requiring immediate medical intervention to support lung development and other vital functions that would normally require several more weeks of gestation to reach viability. The temporary vampire abilities granted by Alexander's ritual allowed Elena to survive delivery complications that would have killed a normal human mother. Her enhanced healing, closing internal bleeding, while supernatural energy sustained her through blood loss that exceeded safe medical parameters. Dr. Chen found herself treating patients whose physiology changed moment by moment as the ritual's effects spread through Elena's system, requiring constant adjustment of medical protocols to account for healing rates and metabolic processes that defied normal human parameters. The babies themselves proved remarkably resilient despite their premature state, their vampire heritage providing accelerated development that partially compensated for early birth, while their connection to both parents created a support network that sustained them through the dangerous first hours of life outside the womb. Alexander's weakening became apparent as the ritual progressed. His immortal essence distributed among 4 individuals, creating a drain on his resources that left him visibly diminished despite his attempts to maintain strength for the ongoing crisis that surrounded their improvised delivery room. The government facility's destruction became inevitable as supernatural forces overwhelmed technological defenses that had never been tested against a coordinated assault by multiple species, working in concert for the first time in recorded history. Director Walsh's attempts to salvage her research priorities crumbled along with the building's structural integrity, forcing her to choose between preserving valuable data and ensuring her own survival as explosions compromised the installation's electromagnetic shielding and allowed supernatural abilities to function at full strength within areas that had been designed to suppress them completely. Elena emerged from the facility carrying one of her newborn children, while Alexander supported her weakened form. The other 2 babies secured in improvised carriers that Dr. Chen and Lydia had constructed from medical equipment and supernatural materials that would protect the infants during transport to safer locations. The alliance that had formed to rescue Elena proved its effectiveness through the successful infiltration and destruction of what had been considered an impregnable government stronghold, demonstrating that cooperation between supernatural species could achieve objectives that individual courts could never accomplish through independent action. But the victory carried costs that extended beyond the immediate casualties and destruction, as Elena's dependence on Alexander's life force created a connection that bound their fates together in ways that neither fully understood, while the baby's survival came at the price of vulnerability that made them dependent on continuous supernatural support for proper development. The rescue had saved their lives, but created new complications that would require careful management and ongoing cooperation between species that had historically viewed each other with suspicion and hostility, forcing former enemies to work together, not just for immediate survival, but for the long-term welfare of children, whose existence represented hope for supernatural evolution or potential catalyst for devastating warfare, depending on how their unique heritage developed over time. The unprecedented alliance that emerged from the crisis represented a fundamental shift in supernatural politics that overturned centuries of territorial disputes and species prejudice in favor of unified response to the existential threat posed by human technological advancement and military coordination. Queen Titania's Fey courts provided magical protection that complemented vampire military efficiency and werewolf territorial knowledge, creating a defensive network that covered the entire metropolitan area while establishing secure communication channels between groups that had previously interacted only through formal treaties or open warfare. Elena found herself thrust into the role of diplomatic coordinator despite having no training in supernatural politics, her unique position as human mother to vampire children and mate to the vampire king, making her the only individual capable of bridging perspectives that had been shaped by millennia of mutual antagonism and competing territorial claims. The triplets became living symbols of supernatural unity, their successful survival representing proof that cooperation between species could produce results that none could achieve independently, while their ongoing medical needs required continuous collaboration between vampire, fae, and human specialists who had to develop entirely new treatment protocols for hybrid children whose physiology defied established medical understanding. Alexander's weakened condition following the ritual became a source of concern for alliance strategists, who recognized that their military coordination depended on his leadership and supernatural authority. But Elena's borrowed vampire abilities partially compensated for his diminished capacity while demonstrating the potential for human enhancement through supernatural means that open new possibilities for long-term cooperation. The Alliance's defensive preparations revealed the scope of human government knowledge about supernatural society, as intelligence gathering indicated that Director Walsh's facility represented only one component of a larger research and containment program that had been operating in secret for decades across multiple government agencies and military installations. Dr. Chen's integration into the supernatural medical team provided essential expertise for treating Elena's ongoing adaptation to vampire abilities while monitoring the triplets' development under conditions that had no precedent in either human or supernatural medical literature. Her willingness to embrace new paradigms becoming crucial for maintaining the health of individuals whose survival represented hope for peaceful coexistence between species. Elena's discovery of her enhanced psychic abilities came gradually as her temporary vampire powers settled into stable patterns, manifesting first as increased sensitivity to emotional atmospheres and growing into genuine precognitive visions that showed possible futures with startling clarity and devastating implications for everyone she loved. The visions arrived without warning or control, overwhelming her consciousness with images of potential outcomes that ranged from triumphant cooperation between species to apocalyptic warfare that consumed both supernatural and human civilizations in cycles of revenge and retaliation that could last for generations. The most terrifying vision showed her own death during full-term delivery of additional children, her body unable to survive the strain of multiple supernatural pregnancies, while Alexander watched helplessly as the love that had transformed him into a protector consumed the woman who had given meaning to his immortal existence. Even worse was the vision of Alexander's response to her death, his grief transforming him into the tyrant that Victor's faction had always claimed he could become, waging total war against humanity, while their surviving children grew up shaped by their father's rage and loss, rather than the love and cooperation their births were meant to represent. The triplets demonstrated increasing awareness of their mother's visions, their behavior becoming agitated whenever Elena experienced precognitive episodes, their developing consciousness somehow detecting the distress that accompanied her glimpses of possible disasters that could destroy everything they were fighting to build. Elena faced the impossible choice between sharing her visions with the Alliance and potentially causing the very conflicts she had seen by revealing information that could shatter the fragile cooperation that currently held their coalition together. Victor's survival added another layer of complexity to an already precarious situation, his traditionalist faction gaining support among vampires who viewed the Alliance as corruption of their species' natural superiority, and Elena's influence as evidence that Alexander had been compromised by human emotional weaknesses that made him unfit to rule their kind. The visions showed Victor's eventual challenge coming not through direct confrontation, but through political maneuvering that would force Alexander to choose between maintaining the alliance and keeping his throne, a decision that could determine whether their children grew up in a world moving toward peace or one consumed by supernatural civil war that would make human threats seem manageable by comparison. The ancient prophecy lay hidden in the mansion's deepest library vaults, inscribed on parchments so old they predated most written languages and required Casimir's scholarly expertise to translate from symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The discovery came when Elena's growing psychic abilities began resonating with supernatural artifacts throughout the mansion, causing books to fall open to relevant passages and scrolls to unroll themselves as if guided by invisible hands seeking to reveal long-buried truths. The prophecy spoke in cryptic verse about three who are one, children born of love between mortal and immortal, who would either unite the supernatural world in unprecedented harmony or destroy it entirely through power that exceeded all previous understanding of vampire capabilities. Elena felt recognition pierce her consciousness like lightning as she read the ancient words, understanding finally that her visions weren't random glimpses of possible futures, but fragments of this prophecy manifesting through her enhanced psychic abilities, showing her the critical moments when the fate of both supernatural and human worlds would hang in the balance of decisions not yet made. The prophecy described a choice that the mother must make between saving her children and saving the world, a decision that would determine whether the three who are one became bridges between species or weapons that would tear apart the careful balance that had allowed supernatural beings to coexist with humanity in secret for millennia. Casimir's translation revealed additional disturbing details about the children's potential abilities, describing powers that would manifest differently in each child, but combine to create something greater than the sum of their individual gifts when they worked together or experienced strong emotional connections. The triplets had already begun showing remarkable development despite their recent premature birth, their supernatural heritage accelerating their growth at rates that astounded even vampire medical specialists, while their awareness expanded to encompass concepts and abilities that normal infants wouldn't develop for years or decades. Elena watched with growing wonder and concern as her children demonstrated distinct supernatural abilities that matched the prophecy's descriptions with terrifying accuracy, each child manifesting different aspects of their hybrid nature while remaining connected through bonds that seemed to strengthen rather than diminish as they grew older and more powerful. The first child, whom Elena had named Arya, showed an affinity for shadow manipulation that began as playful interaction with darkness in her nursery and developed into conscious control over shadows throughout the mansion. Her infant hands moving with purpose to create shapes and patterns that responded to her emotional states and seemed to communicate meaning that adults could sense but not fully understand. Dmitri, the second child, demonstrated telepathic abilities that initially manifested as unusual responsiveness to his parents' emotions and gradually became more focused until Elena realized he was reading surface thoughts and responding to mental communication rather than spoken words. The third child, Sophia, inherited Elena's prophetic gifts in concentrated form, her infant eyes focusing on empty air, as if watching events that others couldn't see, while her unusual sleep patterns suggested she was experiencing visions during times when normal babies would be resting peacefully. The Supernatural Alliance members who witnessed the children's developing abilities reacted with mixtures of awe and terror, recognizing that the prophecy's fulfillment was occurring before their eyes while disagreeing fundamentally about whether the triplets represented salvation or catastrophe for their various species. Queen Titania's Fey court interpreted the prophecy as confirmation that the children belonged in the Fey realm, where their powers could be properly guided and controlled, while Alpha Morrison's werewolves saw the accelerating abilities as proof that hybrid supernatural beings posed existential threats that required immediate intervention before the children became too powerful to contain or control. Alexander's vampire court split into factions that viewed the prophecy either as validation of their king's wisdom in creating potential heirs or as evidence that his emotional attachment to Elena had compromised his judgment in ways that could destroy vampire civilization through uncontrolled supernatural experimentation. Elena found herself studying ancient texts while watching her children develop at supernatural speeds, trying to understand how the prophecy's vague predictions might guide her decisions while dealing with the immediate challenges of raising infants whose abilities already surpassed those of many adult supernatural beings and continued expanding with each passing day. Victor's coordinated attack revealed the depth of his preparation and the extent of his political connections as explosives tore through the mansion's ancient stones with precision that spoke of inside knowledge and careful planning that could only have come from someone intimately familiar with the building's layout and defensive systems. The alliance between Victor's vampire traditionalists and Director Walsh's human supremacist faction represented an unholy marriage of convenience that combined vampire political ambition with human technological capabilities, creating a threat that neither Elena nor Alexander had anticipated, despite their growing awareness that enemies surrounded them on all sides. The attack began during what should have been a secure alliance meeting. Supernatural leaders gathered in the mansion's great hall to coordinate defensive strategies, while Elena and the triplets remained in the heavily protected nursery that had been reinforced with both magical and technological barriers. Victor's survival had been concealed through supernatural means that allowed him to heal from wounds that should have been fatal, while gathering support among vampires who viewed Alexander's alliance with other species as betrayal of vampire supremacy that threatened their traditional dominance over the supernatural world. Director Walsh's cooperation provided human military expertise and technological weapons that could neutralize supernatural abilities, while Victor's insider knowledge enabled precise targeting of structural weaknesses and security gaps that normal human intelligence could never have identified. The explosions began simultaneously throughout the mansion, coordinated detonations that brought down entire sections of the building, while specially equipped human forces moved through the chaos with weapons designed to exploit the electromagnetic interference created by their own demolition charges. Elena felt the attack through her connection to the mansion's protective wards, ancient magic screaming as it was torn apart by forces it had never been designed to resist, while the triplets responded to the violence with agitated crying that seemed to resonate through supernatural frequencies and cause additional structural damage to the already compromised building. Marcus's betrayal cut deeper than the physical destruction because his role as Alexander's trusted enforcer had given him access to every aspect of their defensive preparations, including the location of safe rooms and escape routes that Victor's forces now targeted with deadly precision that left the Alliance leaders trapped in killing zones rather than protected positions. The revelation of Marcus's treachery came through Elena's accidental use of her children's combined psychic abilities as she desperately sought to protect them from the collapsing nursery, her maternal instincts somehow tapping into the triplets' developing powers and creating a psychic shockwave that swept through the mansion like supernatural radar, revealing the thoughts and loyalties of everyone within range, while simultaneously alerting supernatural beings across the city to the immense potential contained within 3 infant minds. Elena experienced Marcus's betrayal as a rush of memories and motivations that showed his gradual corruption by Victor's promises of power and position in a new vampire regime that would restore traditional hierarchies and eliminate the dangerous experiments in cooperation that had characterized Alexander's recent policies. The psychic shockwave revealed not only Marcus's guilt, but also the extent of the conspiracy against them, showing Elena visions of other Alliance members who harbored doubts about supernatural cooperation, while providing Victor with intelligence about defensive preparations and political vulnerabilities that could be exploited. But the uncontrolled use of the triplets' combined abilities also announced their location and potential to every supernatural being within a 50-mile radius, creating a supernatural beacon that would draw both allies and enemies to the mansion with unprecedented speed and determination. Queen Titania suffered critical injuries during the attack when structural damage brought down sections of the ancient ceiling while she attempted to maintain protective barriers around the surviving Alliance members. Her face magic overwhelmed by the combination of technological weapons and vampire political treachery that had been coordinated specifically to neutralize her defensive capabilities. Elena found herself sheltering her children in the rubble of what had been their secure nursery, holding three infants whose supernatural abilities far exceeded her capacity to control or understand. While the building burned around them, and enemies approached from multiple directions with technology and magic designed specifically to capture or kill her family. The psychic shockwave had revealed the full scope of the threats they faced, but it had also demonstrated the terrifying potential of her children's combined powers when channeled through emotional extremes, raising questions about whether she could control abilities that might be necessary for their survival, but could also fulfill the prophecy's darker predictions about children who might destroy the world they were meant to unite. The Alliance's collapse came swiftly as supernatural leaders who had survived the initial attack found themselves facing enemies from within their own ranks. Trust shattered by revelations that conspiracy had penetrated to the highest levels of their coalition, while technological weapons neutralized the supernatural advantages that had made cooperation seem strategically viable. Elena watched helplessly as Queen Titania's injuries proved beyond immediate healing. The Fey Queen's diminished condition, removing the magical protections that had shielded the Alliance from detection by hostile human forces, while her reduced political authority created power vacuums that ambitious subordinates immediately began exploiting for their own territorial advantage. Alpha Morrison's werewolf contingent suffered devastating losses when Victor's human allies deployed silver-enhanced explosives that had been specifically designed to exploit werewolf vulnerabilities, forcing the surviving pack members to choose between continued cooperation with vampires and strategic withdrawal to protect their own species from further casualties. Alexander's condition deteriorated rapidly as wounds inflicted during the attack refused to heal properly, his distributed life force among Elena and the triplets creating healing complications that normal vampire physiology could have resolved instantly, leaving him visibly weakened at the worst possible moment when his leadership was most needed to hold together what remained of the supernatural alliance. Elena faced the prophetic choice that her visions had shown her repeatedly, understanding finally that the moment had arrived when she would have to decide between multiple catastrophic options, each carrying consequences that could determine whether her children grew up in a world moving toward peace or one consumed by warfare that would make current conflicts seem manageable by comparison. The ritual reversal that could save Alexander would require withdrawing the supernatural energy that sustained the triplets, essentially choosing between her lover's survival and her children's lives, while the alternative ritual that would make the children fully vampire would ensure their survival but potentially transform them into beings too powerful for anyone to control or guide safely. Government forces had surrounded the mansion's ruins with military equipment designed to contain supernatural threats, while surviving supernatural courts demanded immediate custody of the triplets whose demonstrated abilities made them either the most valuable assets or the greatest threats in the supernatural world, depending on political perspective and species loyalty. Elena held her children close while flames consumed the ancient mansion around them, knowing that whatever choice she made in the next few moments would echo through generations and determine whether the prophecy of three who are one would bring salvation or destruction to both supernatural and human civilizations that had finally revealed themselves to each other in the worst possible circumstances of violence and betrayal. Director Walsh commanded the final assault on the mansion from a mobile command center that bristled with technology specifically developed from analysis of Elena's blood samples and the electromagnetic signature readings collected during previous supernatural encounters. Her years of preparation culminating in a coordinated strike that combined overwhelming firepower with supernatural countermeasures designed to neutralize every known vampire, fae, and werewolf ability through targeted frequency disruption and blessed ammunition that had been consecrated according to multiple religious traditions. The attack came with military precision that exploited the chaos already consuming the supernatural alliance, striking while Victor's rebellion divided vampire loyalties and Queen Titania's injuries left the Fae courts leaderless and vulnerable to political fragmentation that prevented coordinated magical defense. Elena felt her temporary vampire abilities fading like water through her fingers as the electromagnetic assault disrupted the supernatural energy that had sustained her enhanced capabilities, leaving her increasingly human and vulnerable, while trying to protect three children whose powers were growing exponentially beyond anyone's ability to contain or control safely. The mansion's ancient stones cracked and crumbled under sustained bombardment from weapons that combined conventional explosives with supernatural disruptors, while specialized units equipped with electromagnetic pulse generators created dead zones where supernatural abilities simply ceased to function, allowing ordinary humans to overwhelm beings who had relied on centuries of enhanced strength and speed for survival. Elena found herself at the epicenter of a supernatural war zone that defied every assumption about the boundaries between human and supernatural conflicts, as military helicopters circled overhead while vampire refugees fought desperate running battles through corridors filled with smoke and falling debris. The triplets responded to their mother's terror and the violence surrounding them by manifesting their abilities in ways that had never been recorded or anticipated, their infant minds unable to process or control the powers flowing through them as their emotional distress triggered supernatural phenomena that affected everyone within the mansion's grounds. Arya's shadow manipulation spiraled beyond conscious control as her distress caused darkness to consume entire rooms, shadows flowing like living creatures that devoured light and sound while creating pockets of absolute blackness, where normal physics seemed suspended and human electronics failed completely. The shadows moved with predatory intelligence that suggested the infant was unconsciously accessing supernatural realms that existed parallel to normal reality, her powers drawing on sources of darkness that had never before been tapped by vampire abilities and creating phenomena that terrified even experienced supernatural beings who thought they understood the limits of shadow magic. Dimitri's telepathic abilities exploded outward without restraint or focus, his infant mind broadcasting raw emotion and fragmented thoughts that overwhelmed everyone within a 100-yard radius, creating telepathic feedback loops that left humans and supernatural beings alike clutching their heads in agony while experiencing chaotic flashes of memory and sensation from dozens of different perspectives simultaneously. The uncontrolled telepathic storm made coordinated defense impossible as combatants on all sides found their thoughts invaded by alien perspectives and conflicting loyalties while their own mental processes became accessible to anyone within range of Dimitri's expanding psychic influence. Sophia's prophetic abilities manifested as cascading visions that swept through everyone present like supernatural tsunamis, showing multiple possible futures where the current battle led to apocalyptic outcomes that ranged from total human victory that enslaved all supernatural beings to complete supernatural domination that reduced humanity to livestock for vampire feeding and fae entertainment. The prophetic visions created temporal distortions that made it impossible to distinguish between present reality and potential futures, as participants in the battle found themselves experiencing their own deaths and victories simultaneously, while struggling to determine which timeline represented actual events versus supernatural projections of what might occur. Elena watched in helpless horror as her children's uncontrolled abilities transformed the mansion into a supernatural battleground that exceeded the worst predictions of ancient prophecies. Understanding finally that the choice she faced wasn't between saving her children or saving the world, but finding a way to prevent their powers from destroying everyone she loved while they remained too young to understand or control their own abilities. The moment of clarity came when Elena realized that the prophecy's true meaning had been obscured by centuries of misinterpretation that assumed the choice between children and world required sacrifice rather than synthesis, and that the path forward lay not in containing the triplets' power, but in creating connections that would stabilize their abilities through distributed support from willing supernatural allies. Elena staggered through the burning mansion, calling to the surviving supernatural leaders who had taken shelter in the building's reinforced basement, her voice carrying above the sounds of battle as she explained her revelation about the prophecy's actual intent and the possibility of performing a modified ritual that could save everyone rather than forcing impossible choices between competing loyalties. Casimir responded first, despite his injuries from the building's collapse, his scholarly understanding of ancient magic, allowing him to grasp immediately how Elena's proposed ritual could extend Alexander's life, sharing connection to include multiple participants who would voluntarily accept portions of the supernatural burden rather than leaving it concentrated in a single family unit that was rapidly approaching the breaking point. Queen Titania, second in command, spoke for the injured Fey Queen, agreeing to contribute Fey magic to the ritual despite the political risks involved in creating supernatural bonds that would link their court's fate to vampire politics and human concerns in ways that violated centuries of Fey isolationist policy. Alpha Morrison's surviving pack members overcame their species' traditional hostility toward vampires and Fae when they witnessed the children's potential for either destruction or healing, recognizing that their own survival might depend on creating stability for beings whose uncontrolled abilities could tear apart the careful balance that allowed supernatural society to coexist with human civilization. Dr. Chen emerged from her emergency medical station with supplies and expertise that proved essential for monitoring the vital signs of ritual participants whose physiology would be fundamentally altered by the supernatural connections being proposed. Her medical knowledge providing the scientific framework needed to ensure that magical bonds didn't create biological incompatibilities that could kill volunteers before the ritual achieved its intended stabilizing effects. The modified ritual required precise coordination between multiple supernatural traditions that had never been combined successfully, as vampire blood magic, Fey elemental manipulation, and werewolf pack bonding techniques were woven together into a unified working that created connections between willing participants while distributing the supernatural load that had been overwhelming Elena and Alexander's individual capacity to sustain three rapidly developing hybrid children. Elena felt the ritual's effects as warmth spreading through her body, as the desperate isolation of trying to protect her children alone transformed into shared responsibility that connected her family to a network of supernatural beings who had committed themselves to the triplets' welfare and development. Alexander's condition stabilized immediately as the life force drain was distributed among multiple volunteers, his wounds beginning to heal as his supernatural energy was no longer stretched beyond sustainable limits, while maintaining enhanced vampires and supporting hybrid children whose needs exceeded normal vampire reproductive requirements. The triplets responded to the expanded connection network with visible relaxation as their abilities found stable channels through which to flow, rather than building up uncontrolled pressure that had been manifesting as destructive supernatural phenomena throughout the mansion and surrounding area. Casimir contributed his centuries of accumulated knowledge and magical expertise, creating intellectual stability that helped focus the children's developing consciousness while providing them with access to wisdom that could guide their understanding of their own abilities and responsibilities. Queen Titania's representative offered Fey magic that connected the children to natural cycles and elemental forces, grounding their vampire nature in broader supernatural traditions that emphasized harmony rather than domination as the proper use of extraordinary abilities. The werewolf pack members provided emotional stability through their pack bonding traditions, creating family connections that extended beyond Elena and Alexander, to include protective relationships with beings who understood loyalty and sacrifice as fundamental values rather than weaknesses to be exploited by enemies or political rivals. Dr. Chen monitored the ritual's medical aspects with equipment that had been modified to track supernatural as well as biological processes. Her careful attention to vital signs and physiological changes, ensuring that the magical connections didn't create incompatibilities that could damage participants' health or compromise their species-specific abilities. The ritual's completion coincided with the battle's climax, as the triplets' newly stabilized abilities manifested in ways that transformed destruction into protection, their powers working in harmony to create a supernatural barrier that surrounded the mansion and repelled both human weapons and hostile supernatural forces without causing permanent harm to attackers who had been motivated by fear and misunderstanding rather than genuine malice. Arya's shadow manipulation evolved from consuming darkness into protective veils that absorbed incoming projectiles and energy weapons while creating cover for wounded combatants, regardless of their species' allegiance. Her abilities guided by newfound stability that allowed conscious control rather than emotional reactivity. Dimitri's telepathic capabilities shifted from overwhelming mental broadcasting to selective communication that enabled supernatural coordination while projecting calming influences that reduced aggression and fear among humans who had been taught to view all supernatural beings as existential threats requiring elimination. Sophia's prophetic abilities focused on positive future outcomes rather than apocalyptic possibilities, sharing visions of peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit that helped combatants on all sides understand the potential consequences of continued warfare versus the advantages of negotiated settlement. Victor's rebellion collapsed as his own followers witnessed the children's benevolent use of their abilities to heal rather than harm. Supernatural beings who had been convinced that hybrid children represented existential threats, finding themselves protected by the same powers they had sought to eliminate through violence and political maneuvering. Director Walsh found her technological advantages neutralized by supernatural abilities that adapted to her countermeasures faster than human engineering could develop new solutions, while the evidence of supernatural healing and protection forced her to reconsider assumptions about the fundamental incompatibility between human and supernatural interests that had driven decades of secret warfare and research programs. Elena felt the strain of the ritual's completion as exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, her body and mind pushed beyond normal human limits by the supernatural connections that had saved her children, but extracted costs that might prove impossible for her enhanced but still fundamentally human physiology to sustain indefinitely. The triplets stabilized into peaceful sleep for the first time since their premature birth, their abilities finally balanced and supported by the network of supernatural allies who had committed themselves to their welfare and development. But Elena's collapse suggested that the ritual's success might have come at a price that could still claim her life, despite achieving the stability and protection they had desperately sought through months of escalating conflict and political maneuvering. Elena awakened to sunlight streaming through windows that had been replaced with crystal, that captured and refracted morning light into prismatic rainbows that danced across walls decorated with artwork from both human and supernatural cultures, her body feeling fundamentally different in ways that went beyond the exhaustion and relief of surviving the ritual that had saved her children and prevented supernatural warfare. Dr. Chen monitored her recovery with instruments that combined traditional medical equipment with magical sensors designed to track the supernatural changes occurring in Elena's physiology, documenting transformations that created something entirely new, rather than simply human, enhanced with vampire abilities or vampire diminished by human limitations. The ritual had changed Elena at the cellular level, extending her lifespan to something approaching vampire longevity, while granting enhanced abilities that complemented rather than mirrored Alexander's powers. creating a partnership that balanced supernatural strength with human intuition and emotional intelligence, that could bridge species differences in ways that pure vampire or human perspectives never could achieve alone. Elena discovered that her psychic abilities had stabilized into reliable precognitive gifts that allowed her to sense emotional currents and predict interpersonal conflicts before they escalated into violence, while her physical capabilities remained recognizably human but enhanced to levels that allowed her to keep pace with supernatural beings without losing her essential humanity. The triplets had responded to the ritual's stabilizing effects by settling into rapid but healthy development patterns that combined vampire supernatural growth with human emotional maturation, their distinct personalities emerging with clarity that amazed everyone who witnessed their daily progress, from helpless infants to aware individuals with unique gifts and perspectives. Arya demonstrated protective instincts that manifested through her shadow manipulation abilities. Her control over darkness, evolving from unconscious emotional responses to deliberate protective actions that shielded family members and friends from threats, both physical and psychological. Her intuitive understanding of danger, making her a natural guardian for her siblings and parents. Dimitri's telepathic gifts developed into empathic abilities that allowed him to sense and respond to emotional pain in others. His curiosity about human and supernatural psychology driving him to explore the mental landscapes of everyone he encountered while maintaining ethical boundaries that prevented him from violating others' privacy without permission. Sophia's prophetic abilities manifested as wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young, her visions of future possibilities guiding her toward choices that promoted harmony and understanding rather than conflict, her calming presence serving as an anchor for her more volatile siblings when their powers threatened to overwhelm their developing emotional control. Dr. Chen had established a revolutionary medical practice that specialized in supernatural healthcare, her clinic becoming a neutral ground where humans and supernatural beings could receive treatment that addressed both biological and magical health concerns through integrated approaches that combined scientific methodology with supernatural healing traditions from multiple cultures and species. Elena's recovery period became an opportunity to understand how the ritual had created connections between her family and their supernatural allies, bonds that went beyond political alliance to genuine caring relationships that provided emotional support and practical assistance as they navigated the complexities of raising hybrid children whose abilities and needs exceeded any previous parental experience. Alexander remained constantly present during Elena's recovery, his relief at her survival tempered by amazement at how she had managed to find solutions that saved everyone, rather than forcing the impossible choices that ancient prophecies had seemed to demand through centuries of tragic interpretation and failed attempts to understand their true meaning. The mansion's reconstruction proceeded under supernatural supervision that incorporated both human engineering principles and magical architecture, creating living spaces that could accommodate the needs of multiple species while serving as a symbol of cooperation that demonstrated practical benefits of interspecies collaboration rather than simply political necessity driven by mutual threats and shared enemies. Elena's first attempts to walk revealed that her enhanced abilities included improved balance and coordination that allowed her to move with grace that approached supernatural fluidity while maintaining the essential humanity that made her an effective intermediary between species that had spent centuries viewing each other with suspicion and hostility based on fundamental differences in values and survival strategies. The supernatural peace accords took 6 months of careful negotiation to draft, and another 3 months of political maneuvering to ratify. But the ceremony that celebrated their signing transformed the mansion's great hall into a gathering place where human diplomats sat alongside vampire nobility, fey royalty, and werewolf pack leaders in recognition that the future of all their species depended on cooperation, rather than the territorial conflicts and species supremacy that had characterized supernatural politics for millennia. Elena served as the primary mediator during the Accord's negotiations. Her unique position as human mother to vampire children and mate to the vampire king, providing her with perspectives that allowed her to understand competing interests while finding compromise solutions that addressed essential concerns without forcing any party to abandon fundamental values or survival strategies. The Accords established formal diplomatic relations between human governments and supernatural courts, creating legal frameworks for interaction that replaced the secret warfare and covert operations that had previously characterized human supernatural relations with transparent negotiation and mutual recognition of territorial rights and species-specific needs. Elena's role as the first human supernatural ambassador required her to master diplomatic protocols from multiple cultures while developing new approaches to interspecies communication that could bridge fundamental differences in worldview and social organization without forcing artificial conformity that would eventually create resentment and renewed conflict. The triplets received official recognition as citizens of both human and supernatural worlds, rather than possessions to be claimed by competing factions. Their legal status establishing precedent for future hybrid children, while ensuring they would grow up with protection from multiple governmental and supernatural authorities, rather than being viewed as experimental subjects or political pawns. Alexander's evolution from solitary ruler to collaborative leader reflected the profound changes that parenthood and partnership had brought to someone who had spent centuries making decisions based solely on vampire interests. His love for Elena and his children, expanding his perspective to include concern for the broader supernatural community and its relationship with humanity. The Accords included provisions for cultural exchange programs that would allow humans and supernatural beings to learn about each other through education and shared experiences, rather than the fear and misunderstanding that had previously shaped their interactions, with the mansion serving as a primary location for these programs, and Elena providing oversight that ensured mutual respect and genuine learning, rather than superficial tolerance or patronizing curiosity. 2 years of careful implementation had transformed the Accords from political documents into lived reality, as Elena and Alexander's marriage ceremonies celebrated both human traditions and vampire customs, their wedding becoming a symbol of interspecies cooperation that demonstrated how love could transcend fundamental differences without requiring either party to abandon essential aspects of their identity or cultural heritage. The triplets attended a special school designed for supernatural children that provided education appropriate for their accelerated development, while ensuring they learned to interact appropriately with both human and supernatural peers, their curriculum including languages, cultures, and magical traditions from multiple species, along with conventional academic subjects. Elena's daily routine included diplomatic responsibilities that required her to mediate disputes between human authorities and supernatural courts, while maintaining her role as mother to children whose needs and abilities continued evolving as they grew older and more powerful, each day bringing new challenges that tested her ability to balance personal and political demands. The mansion had become a cultural center, where humans and supernatural beings gathered for conferences, artistic collaborations, and educational programs that demonstrated practical benefits of interspecies cooperation while providing safe spaces for interaction that might otherwise be impossible due to legal restrictions or social prejudices that persisted despite official governmental recognition. Alexander's adaptation to collaborative leadership had surprised many vampire nobles who had expected traditional hierarchical approaches to supernatural governance. But his success in maintaining vampire territorial integrity while participating in broader interspecies cooperation had silenced most critics and provided a model for other supernatural leaders who were considering similar adaptations to changing political realities. Dr. Chen's research initiatives studying supernatural human hybrids had produced medical protocols that made mixed relationships safer and more viable. Her work providing hope for couples who had previously been forced to choose between love and biological compatibility, while contributing to scientific understanding of how supernatural genetics interacted with human physiology. Victor's punishment had been carefully calibrated to serve as warning without creating martyrdom, his survival demonstrating supernatural justice, while his stripped powers ensured he could never again threaten the peace that so many had worked to create and maintain. His presence serving as reminder that prejudice and fear remained constant threats, requiring vigilance and active resistance, rather than passive acceptance of apparent stability. Elena placed her hand on her gently rounded belly as she watched Alexander playing with their triplets in the mansion's garden. The sight of the vampire king pretending to be caught by Arya's playful shadows, while Dmitri giggled at private telepathic jokes, and Sophia offered wise commentary on proper game strategy, filling her with joy that seemed impossible after all the conflict and uncertainty they had survived together. This new pregnancy felt different from the supernatural intensity that had characterized carrying the triplets, the purely human children developing within her, representing hope for a future where mixed families could exist without political complications or supernatural interference, where love between species could produce offspring who inherited the best of both worlds without the burden of becoming symbols or weapons in ancient conflicts. Dr. Chen's monitoring of this pregnancy combined scientific instruments with magical oversight that ensured both mother and babies remained healthy, while documenting how Elena's enhanced physiology affected normal human reproduction, her research contributing to medical understanding that would benefit other couples navigating similar circumstances in a world where supernatural human relationships were becoming increasingly common and accepted. The garden itself had become a living symbol of interspecies cooperation, with plants from multiple supernatural realms growing alongside human flowers in harmony that demonstrated how different forms of life could thrive together when properly nurtured and protected from those who would destroy what they feared or misunderstood. Elena reflected on how love had indeed transformed not just her personal world, but the broader relationships between species that had spent millennia in conflict, understanding that while the future remained uncertain and peace required constant vigilance, they had proven that cooperation was possible when people chose trust over fear and worked together toward shared goals, rather than competing for dominance or supremacy. The sound of children's laughter, mixed with adult conversation in multiple languages, filled the garden as human and supernatural visitors gathered for another cultural exchange program, their interactions demonstrating that the Accords had achieved more than political stability by creating genuine friendships and understanding between beings who had once viewed each other as natural enemies destined for eternal conflict. 10 years later, Elena stood in the same garden, watching her older children demonstrate how they had grown into their roles as bridges between worlds, each using their unique gifts to strengthen supernatural human relations in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions made during the Accords negotiations. Arya worked with law enforcement agencies that had learned to appreciate her shadow abilities for solving crimes that conventional investigation methods could never have resolved. Her intuitive understanding of danger and protective instincts making her invaluable for cases involving supernatural elements, or particularly complex human psychology. Dmitri had become a counselor specializing in trauma recovery, his empathic abilities allowing him to understand and heal emotional wounds in ways that traditional therapy could never achieve, while his genuine compassion made him beloved by patients who had previously been considered hopeless cases by conventional medical practitioners. Sophia's prophetic gifts had evolved into diplomatic consultation that helped negotiators avoid conflicts before they developed into crises. Her visions of positive outcomes guiding international relations between human governments and supernatural courts, while her wisdom continued amazing everyone who worked with her despite her young age. Elena and Alexander's younger children, purely human but raised with supernatural awareness, represented the next generation of peaceful coexistence as they attended integrated schools where human and supernatural children learned together without the fear and prejudice that had once made such interaction impossible or dangerous. The mansion's memorial garden honored all who had died in the conflicts that led to the Accords, serving as reminder that peace required constant vigilance and active choice to pursue understanding rather than surrendering to the fear and hatred that remain tempting responses to difference and change. Elena's reflection on their journey from that first moment when silent hearts began beating at a vampire's whisper to this future of hope and cooperation filled her with gratitude for love's transformative power and determination to continue nurturing the fragile but growing peace they had all worked so hard to achieve and protect for future generations who would inherit a world where supernatural and human could mean family rather than enemy, where difference could mean strength rather than threat, and where three small heartbeats had indeed changed everything.